All good.
Good. Alright. So, we'll just start, if you just want to introduce yourself, your name and position.
Yep. My name's Matt Marrison, and I'm the Community Engagement Section Leader with the Fox Eradication Program.
Yeah, and how long have you been doing that?
Been working with the program since October 2007, so for a couple of years, I'm coming up onto 3 years now.
Yeah. And, how do you find, what does that encompass? Like, what activities are you doing?
Yep. Well, in the Community Engagement section, we're basically responsible for trying to keep the community informed about the activities of the Fox Eradication Program, as well as consulting with the various stakeholders that we have involved in the fox eradication effort to make sure that they're kept involved and engaged with the whole program to eradicate the red fox from Tasmania.
Yeah, sure. And how do you find the public perception? How do you find they
Yeah, we get a range of views about the fox eradication effort. It's a fairly high profile program. You'll find a lot of people have different views about the effort itself. Some people have different views about whether there are or aren't foxes in Tasmania. We find with the local communities that we work in, the people that have been involved with the program and that have been well informed about the eradication effort, they're generally very supportive about the overall fox eradication program. You'll find some may or may not be certain as to whether there are foxes in the state, but a lot of people just aren't willing to take the risk that foxes might be able to establish, and so are very supportive of the program. So we get a lot of good support from landowners, and we've been very lucky in having very good support from political parties and the Tasmanian government over the last 10 years to make sure that we're doing something to address the threat from an establishing fox population. And also had very good stakeholder support from a number of key stakeholders who are very aware of the serious threat that foxes pose to the state, and have been very proactive in making sure that we're doing all that we can to prevent foxes from establishing here in Tasmania.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, one thing I've just made a note of there, that PowerPoint presentation you gave, is there a chance of getting a copy of that?
Yeah, sure. I might actually have a copy in the car, so I can grab that for you after if you like.
Cool. Alright, well, just a few sort of general questions, okay? Some of this was covered in the information now, but just so we get it.
Yep.
How many foxes do you believe are in Tasmania?
That's always the question we get asked from people in the public as well as in other areas, and we really have no way of giving an accurate estimate of the number of foxes that we have in the state. They're an animal that's extremely cryptic, very difficult to detect when they're in low numbers, and we could be dealing with a fairly small, and we hope we're dealing with a fairly small population in Tasmania, and Tasmania is a very large area and a very complex landscape. There just aren't the technologies or the techniques available to detect foxes when they're in low density populations, so we'd have no way of putting an actual number on it.
Yeah.
I'll just grab that quickly. It's pretty much impossible to put an estimate on the number of foxes we have in the state. We know that we don't have a large population. If there were a large number of foxes in the state, they'd be much more visible, and their impacts would probably be visible as well. We know that we haven't got no foxes in the state because we've got evidence of fox activity from a number of locations across Tasmania. So somewhere between 1 and a very large number, we fall in there somewhere, but whether we're closer to the smaller end or the larger number, we don't know. What we do know is once we do start seeing foxes once they become more highly visible in the landscape, then we've got a real problem. While we're still only getting a small number of sighting reports coming through per week, and while we're not seeing them, and while we've still got sceptics out there who believe that there aren't foxes in the state, we've still got a chance to eradicate them.
Yep. And how widely dispersed are they according to your information? Like, where are they located, and are there any places more so?
Well, over the past 10 years, we've collected evidence from a range of locations across the state, confirming fox activity from those locations. The spread is from the far northwest, so up around Boat Harbour, through to the northeast, around Gladstone, down through the central Midlands, so places like Longford, Campbelltown, Canara, all the way down to Oatlands. There's been evidence of fox activity. We've also had evidence collected on the east coast at Seymour, and most recently with some of the monitoring work that's been undertaken in the past year, we've collected evidence as far south as Geefston and up to areas like Bushy Park and Campania around Hobart. So we don't know whether that evidence is from a wide-ranging fox population, so a small number of foxes that move large distances in the landscape, or whether it might be a large number of foxes, because the technology just isn't there at the moment to be able to identify individual foxes from the evidence that we're collecting. But it does show that we've got widespread locations of fox activity within the state, but we just don't know whether it's a small number of foxes that are moving around a lot, or it's showing a larger number of foxes that we've got here in the state.
Do they tend to move much? Are they territorial, or do they move like around randomly?
In general, the knowledge we have about fox ecology and behaviour is from studies of foxes in high density populations, such as on the mainland. We're not sure whether foxes are exhibiting that sort of behaviour here in Tasmania. While they're in an establishing population, they may exhibit different behavioural traits to an established population. But on the mainland, we know that foxes generally will establish a territory, and you establish a territory to protect resources from other foxes around you. Those territories can be large or small, and it depends on the number of foxes in the area, as well as the amount of resources in a particular area. In Tasmania, we could be dealing with a small number of foxes. We've got a very resource-rich environment for them. They may not have a neighbour nearby, so they may not be establishing a territory, just because they're not needing to defend resources from other foxes. So it could be that they're very wide-ranging in the state. We just don't know, and there hasn't been any research done on establishing fox populations anywhere else in the world, because quite simply you can't detect them when they're in low numbers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now, does the evidence you've collected point to the fact that foxes are breeding in Tasmania?
Well, we've had no evidence collected, or no evidence of a breeding population confirmed in the state. We've never found an active den. We haven't found cubs or young animals in the state other than the fox carcass that was picked up at Lillico Beach. That was from the forensic analysis undertaken of that carcass. It indicated it was a 4 to 6 month old animal. But we don't know whether that was necessarily evidence of a breeding population, or it could have been an immigrant into the state from the mainland. We know in the past that there's been both deliberate and accidental introductions into Tasmania. We don't know whether that one may have been a recent arrival into the state, or it was possible evidence of a breeding population. We're slightly reassured by the fact that we haven't found dens, that given the amount of evidence that's been collected over the past 10 years, you'd have to assume that possibly breeding has occurred in the state, but we haven't been able to confirm that one way or the other at this stage.
Yeah, that's something that has been commented upon, the fact that dens are generally considered easy to find. Is that the case?
Again, most of the understanding we have about foxes, about ecology and behaviour, is from high density populations where on the mainland they're very easy to find. Anyone can go out at night with a spotlight and with a fox whistle and call up a fox. Because they're in high density populations, they're not able to, basically they're forced to be highly visible in the landscape, because they're competing with other foxes for the resources that are there. So they're very visible on the mainland, and finding dens is no real problem on the mainland either, because of the high density populations. The animal itself is hardwired to avoid detection. It doesn't want to be found. That's why it's such a successful coloniser of new environments. It's able to avoid detection until it's established, until it's in large numbers, and then has to be highly visible in the landscape. In the past in Tasmania, we haven't actually done a great deal of work, intensive work, looking for dens. So there hasn't been a large amount of resources devoted to that activity. There's been a lot of resources devoted to investigations following fox sighting reports, but we haven't done any intensive monitoring work looking for den sites. It's something we undertake as part of investigations and as part of monitoring, but we haven't actually undertaken sort of intensive program to search for dens. So we're not particularly surprised that none have been found, given that foxes, the evidence elsewhere, the research shows that they're trying to avoid detection. They're going to put dens where they're somewhere safe, where they're able to keep an eye on the surrounding landscape. So it might be that we just haven't been looking in the right places, or we haven't been lucky at this stage in finding a den.
Let's try something, just turning these lights on. Just some light, get rid of it.
Cool, get rid of it.
That's all good though. So at the moment the program seems to be focusing on the 1080 baiting. Do you believe that the 1080 program can eradicate foxes?
All the advice we've received and all the evidence from elsewhere, from where 1080 has been used to control fox populations, indicates that as part of an integrated program, it can successfully eradicate foxes. It can't do it on its own. It's only one technique that you would employ in trying to eradicate foxes, but it is, at this stage, our best defence against fox establishment. It's a broad-scale landscape coverage technique that's able to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Foxes are an opportunistic animal. They basically are very successful in colonising environments because they're so opportunistic. They'll take food items as they find them. We know that on the mainland, in a number of areas, baiting programs have been very successful in eradicating foxes from local areas. So particularly where they're looking at doing wildlife management and conservation of wildlife species. Aerial baiting programs in particular in Western Australia have been able to locally eradicate foxes from particular areas. So as part of an integrated program, we believe yes, it can be successful in Tasmania in eradicating foxes, but it still requires other techniques to be employed to pick up those foxes that aren't killed through a baiting program. You'll always get some animals that are bait avoiders, that are bait shy, that aren't interested in taking baits, and you're not always going to get baits into locations where there are foxes. There's a whole range of reasons why you may not put a bait in the right spot. Nicholas, who actually eat the baits as well. From all the work that we've done, it indicates that, I'm not sure where I'm going with that one. From the bait take research, we've only ever identified 2 animals that have been killed through fox baiting programs in Tasmania, so 2 animals confirmed killed, and they've been dogs and cats. From all the research that's been done on native wildlife populations, there's been no identifiable impact from fox baiting programs on native wildlife populations. It's not to say that some native animals are not being killed by fox baits, because we'd have to assume that some would be killed, but the way the program's designed, it is designed to limit any non-target impact. But we also know that the Tasmanian conditions, the climate, the rainfall, and the type of baits that we use and the length of time that they're left in the ground, sometimes when the guys come to retrieve those baits, it's just mush. Yep. It's just what we'd assume would have once been a bait mixed in with dirt. And if they've been in the ground for 20 days, for 28 days, it's very difficult to actually sometimes determine whether you've got a bait left there or you've just got dirt. So some of the bait take that's reported is probably just a result of breakdown of baits in the ground.
So far, would it be safe to assume, I know it's not safe to assume anything, but if a fox had have taken a bait, you would have found it?
No, the evidence from baiting programs on the mainland, where they do them in high density fox populations, is that you don't find fox carcasses from fox baiting programs. And that's because 1080 poison itself, it's actually metabolised within the animal, and it's the metabolite which causes the animal's death. But it takes about, in a fox, on average, for an average fox, for an average bait, it takes about 4 to 6 hours for that bait to kill the animal. In that time, if an animal's starting to feel sick, especially an animal like a fox, it goes into defensive mode, protection mode. It looks for somewhere safe to harbour up, to lay up. So they've found on the mainland, from fox baiting programs, you'll find fox carcasses. If you go and dig up dens or rabbit warrens, you might find carcasses in there from baiting programs. You'll find they go into logs, they go under sheds, they go into the back of hay barns, and that's where those animals die. So they don't generally find carcasses just laying about out in the landscape, even though it's high density populations.
I've read actually, because I heard that they run around like nuts and they end up stuck up against fences and things when they've eaten it. Is that, have you heard?
There's going on the information from people that deliver these programs year in, year out, and also the people that do the research on these programs. They don't report a lot of that sort of behaviour from animals that have been poisoned with 1080 bait. There may have been that other poisons have resulted in that. There's a lot of poisoning that's done in some of these areas, so it's hard sometimes to isolate the particular factors involved. 1080 poison itself, it's not a nice way for animals to die. In looking at the symptoms that they're showing, there's still debate as to whether it is causing pain to the animals or whether it's just similar to a person having an epileptic fit. It looks very, it's uncomfortable to watch someone going through that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those people are in pain. And similar for the work that's been done, the research that's been done on 1080 poisoning. It's a very horrible thing to see an animal die from 1080 poisoning. The RSPCA have done fairly intensive reviews of the available literature, and they're basically sitting on the fence as to whether it's a humane poison or an inhumane poison. They say it shouldn't be considered a humane poison, and you'll find some people make the claim that it is a humane poison. The RSPCA, from some of their work, have said that you can't make that claim, but you can't say that it's an inhumane poison as well. Some of the research that's been done in the past, particularly from human poisoning cases, they've reported they haven't felt pain, even though they've been in a hyper-excited state. They haven't actually experienced pain, but it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's very difficult to get a definitive answer as to whether or not it's causing the animal significant pain or significant harm. And the information we're receiving is you don't see, from the 1080 baiting programs on the mainland, you don't see foxes, either carcasses or animals, running around highly visible after a baiting program has been through.
It's fluoroacetate, is that the name of it?
Yeah, sodium fluoroacetate.
Yeah. You say that wildlife gets this naturally. It says something about that in the...
They have some natural tolerance to 1080 poison, the active ingredient in it, which is the fluoroacetate, and that's because it's actually found as a toxin, a natural chemical defence in some Australian plants.
Or is that...
It's because basically the whole of the Australian wildlife has co-evolved in a landscape where that active ingredient, fluoroacetate, has been present. Most of our animals have varying degrees of tolerance to 1080 poison. The plants that actually have it occurring, have fluoroacetate occurring in them naturally, are predominantly found in Western Australia. So you'll find the West Australian species have a very high tolerance to 1080 poison. But because, again, we're dealing with a landscape that's been, things like Tasmania have been joined by land bridges in the past, the mainland, the whole fauna of the Australian continent has co-evolved with plants that have had fluoroacetate, the active ingredient of 1080 poison, in them. So they have some tolerance. It varies between different animals. Like devils are very tolerant. Things like quolls have a lesser tolerance.
Yep.
But because of that tolerance, because of that natural resistance to 1080 poison, it means that we can use it in a very low dose to target an animal like a fox, which is incredibly susceptible to 1080. So it means it's a really well-suited toxin for use in a landscape like Tasmania, because you can use it in low dose to target foxes, but to give some measure of protection to your native wildlife species. Mm-hmm. So it actually is very, very suitable for fox baiting.
Yep. Good. Well, we'll get on to the shit now. Yeah. Now, you found 56 fox-positive scats, is that right?
To date, there's been 56 fox-positive scats identified.
Okay. And they seem to be on their own when you find a scat. Why is that? Because apparently foxes shit 8 times a day, up to 8 times a day. Why aren't more found around that?
Well, if you look at the distribution of fox scats, there's been areas where there's been a number of fox scats located within a small region. In particular, up around Burnie and around Devonport, around the Sprayton, Barrington area. There's been quite a large number of scats picked up within a small geographical area. There's also been a few locations such as Cygnet last year, where 2 fox scats were picked up within about 500 metres of each other, following a sighting report from a member of the public. They actually reported seeing an animal they believed to be a fox on a number of occasions over a number of nights, and we ended up doing some fairly intensive searching in that area, and 2 of the scats that were collected from that particular region, from that investigation, came back as being fox positive. So we have collected multiple scats from very close locations in a number of areas, but we know that, again, it comes back to our ability to detect foxes in low density populations. There aren't good or reliable techniques at identifying and detecting foxes in low density populations. We know that our ability to detect scats is probably fairly low still. We have to devote a lot of resources in a small area to give ourselves a good chance of finding something that might be there.
But when you found one, I mean, you would imagine there'd be a lot more around. I mean, I know you say you find 1 or 2, but wouldn't there be a lot more?
Again, we don't know whether foxes in the state are moving through the landscape or they're staying within one sort of territory. We also know that in Tasmanian landscape, the breakdown of scats seems to be fairly rapid. We're doing some work at the moment looking at how long scats will persist in the environment. and some of the initial results show that some of them disappear within 24 hours. So we really are, again, working to pioneer, to develop tools that give us a reliable way of detecting foxes in the landscape, but there just aren't the techniques there, and you've still got to be incredibly lucky. You've got to be in the right spot at the right time to even be able to get close to finding evidence. And we're still relying on, we've got two methods of finding scats, and that's either by people, by human searchers, or by dogs. With the dogs, we've got to get them in the right location at the right time for them to be able to pick up a scent. We're dealing with a large state, we're dealing with sighting reports that come in from a whole range of areas. So we've got to get firstly dogs in the right spot at the right time to be able to find scats. And for people, we can have people on the ground in an area where we're fairly sure there are foxes from the sighting reports and from other evidence, but they've still got to walk within a few metres of a fox scat to be able to visually identify it. So it's still a very, detection probabilities are very, very low. We know that we don't have good techniques at locating or detecting foxes in the landscape, so there's still probably a lot of luck. But the resources we do have with the scat detector dogs and things like the scat collection survey that have been run over the past, or been used over the past 3 or 4 years, they have increased our ability to detect fox evidence in the landscape. So we're actually doing a lot better than we have been in the past, but it's still a very process which relies on a lot of luck. Being in the right place at the right time, which is why sighting reports are so important. Gets us a bit closer to the animal.
As far as other techniques to find them, do you use fox calls, like any sort of audio?
There's a range of different techniques that we try and use to give ourselves a greater chance of detecting foxes, and basically bringing them into an area where we're undertaking monitoring activities, and that can be using things like the fox whistles, or we've got calling boxes which mimic the sounds of animals in distress, which are used elsewhere to bring animals in, to bring predators in. So we've used those calling boxes, it's called predator calling, to try and draw foxes in to an area where we're monitoring. And we've also used the fox whistles in the past as well, to try and get foxes to basically come to you, to increase your chance of being able to locate them. The fox is a very cunning animal though. It's very intelligent, very elusive, very good at detecting or determining threats. And if you talk to hunters from the mainland, if you talk to people that deal with foxes every day, they'll tell you that a fox, he's very wary. He knows when someone's out there looking for him. If you're out there with a whistle or a call box, it's playing on its innate instinct to come into an animal in distress call, but it's also going to be very wary about that noise. They generally will circle round, particularly if there's a hunter. Hunters report that foxes will often circle around them. When they're coming into a particular location, they do a full scope on it. They check out the whole area to make sure there's no threats to them, and that's just the way they're wired, that's just the way they've evolved. So in using those call boxes and using those fox whistles, there might be a fox in the area, but he's going to be very wary from day one.
Okay. So
he's still going to do what a fox will do and assess the area before he moves in. And if you're sitting there in the past, they might have been using things like spotlights. You're highly visible in the landscape. You're something very unusual. Foxes are very good at knowing their landscape. Again, this is based on what we know about foxes from the mainland and high density populations, but they know everything in their particular patch. If there's something new, they're going to be wary about it. So they're going to make sure that they know what it is before they expose themselves to any sort of threat. So it really is a very difficult and tricky situation to try and detect foxes when they're in low numbers.
Yeah. People from within in Parks and Wildlife and in the program have said in the media that there have been some elaborate hoaxes, one in St Helens, I believe, or something. What measures do you take when you have found carcasses to fully investigate whether it is a hoax or not?
Yep.
And is that the first thing you look at? And if it is found to be a hoax, what penalties are there? Because it's a very serious thing. And from what I can tell, what I've read, one of the biggest problems is that people are unsure which things have been hoaxes and which aren't, and that's why there's so much distrust. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, there's a few questions there.
Yeah.
In dealing with the evidence that's collected within Tasmania, we have fairly rigorous procedures in terms of how evidence is handled and then also looking at the provenance of that evidence, so looking at the history of that evidence, where it's come from, who's been involved in its collection, are there any question marks over that particular piece of evidence. So you'll find that over the past 10-15 years there's been a range of evidence that's been presented to the public that is being presented as Fox evidence in the state. In terms of the evidence that we report and that we recognise, there's some of those pieces of evidence that aren't on our evidence list that we don't report because there are question marks over it. There are queries over whether it was something that was found in Tasmania or something that maybe had been brought into Tasmania and wasn't a resident animal or wasn't evidence of a resident population. We can only deal with the information that we have and the evidence that we collect. The processes that we employ are designed to give us a chance to assess whether there is any possibility that it's not evidence that's been collected in Tasmania or that isn't from a fox that's resident in the state. But at the end of the day, if people wanted to hoax evidence, which possibly has happened in the past, it could still happen. It could still occur.
Do you think it has happened?
From looking at the history, there are a number of people that believe, yes, there's been evidence that's been hoaxed in the past. It's always...
Isn't it in your interest, though, to make an example of these people and to say, this is a hoax, these people have done the wrong thing, that these penalties will apply to deter other people doing it, and that will make your position a lot more tenable to... Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of people that have hoaxed evidence in the past or may have brought evidence into the state in the past and tried to present it as evidence collected in Tasmania, there are currently very serious penalties for anyone bringing foxes or fox products into the state. So under the Nature Conservation Act, fox is a restricted animal, so live foxes cannot be brought into the state, and there are very severe penalties for importation of live foxes. And under the Animal Health Act, foxes, similarly carcasses or fox products, cannot be brought into the state. And there are also fairly severe penalties for anyone
Have they ever been imposed on people?
In general, off the top of my head, I can't think of any prosecutions in relation to that legislation. There have been seizures at the border when there's been fox products being brought in. Some people just aren't aware of the legislation. So we get a lot of hunters that go over to the mainland to shoot foxes. Sometimes they'll bring back in pelts or skins.
Yeah. That's very different though to... I mean, I think you probably know the one I'm referring to at St Helens, where I think Nick Mooney came out and said it's almost certainly a hoax. For him to say that, and for the media to still be reporting it as real, and there's sort of you're a bit unsure when you refer to it in the info session, isn't it better to be sure on these things? Well,
we can never be sure. There's so many unknowns, and there's so many different stories. I mean, there's people that believe that
but
some
you
of...
could prove it though, couldn't you?
You can only deal with, again, the evidence that you're presented and the facts that are presented to you, unless there's a lot of hearsay about some of the evidence. A lot of that hearsay is not backed up by fact. There's not anything physical, or there's not someone that's going on the record and making a statutory declaration to support some of the claims that are out there. So in terms of being able to say one way or the other that it's definitely a hoax or it's definitely from a resident animal in the state, you can't do it. You can only work with the best information that you have regarding a particular piece of evidence and the evidence that you're presented with. So
if there's a suspicion though, the police should be fully involved, shouldn't they? The police should be taking over?
Well, there's not really... In terms of the legislation which people could be prosecuted under, it's if someone's got a live animal in the state, there's fairly clear legislation there for prosecution of people under the Nature Conservation Act. In relation to someone having fox parts or fox products in the state, there's not the legislation there that would necessarily involve the police in them just possessing fox parts or fox products. Live animals very different, but just having fox parts and fox products, it's not a criminal matter. It's not a police matter.
That surprises me.
If people are in the past where people are believed to have maybe hoaxed evidence, there might be, and I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but there might be wasting public time type prosecutions that could be pursued, but again, the legislation isn't there that's going to prosecute someone just for having, you know, a fox product in the state.
Yeah, but
If they're bringing
it's
it
one
through,
thing to say, it's one thing having it, and another thing to say, oh, I've found this is a fox, it's in Tasmania, which is different, hoax, as opposed to having a pelt or something. So, I mean, would you like the police to be more involved?
Most of the people that have said they've found a fox in Tasmania or a fox carcass, they've stuck to those stories. They haven't changed their stories. They're not saying that they've brought in that carcass. There might be other people around them that are saying that they've brought in a carcass. It might be speculating. That might be, again, dealing with hearsay. But you'll find most of the people involved, and we don't necessarily have names because a lot of the information that is received has been anonymous. There's been a couple of incidents where carcasses have been reported where we don't have a name for the person that's either found the carcass or that's supplied the photographs and other evidence, but they don't change their story. They never actually say that, you know, oh no, this was a hoax, or no, I did this as a bit of a joke. You'll find that most of the people that have reported that information have stuck to those stories. There's other people that said no, it's, you know, it's a hoax. It's not an example of a true fox carcass being picked up in Tasmania, or that photograph wasn't of a fox in Tasmania. But again, you haven't got any other evidence to deal with. You haven't got someone who's got basically a photograph of them with the fox or a carcass in Victoria, and then a photograph of them in the state. So you're constantly dealing with hearsay. We don't deal with that hearsay. If there's questions over evidence, we don't deal with that. We put it on the record as being possible evidence, but it doesn't go on as being part of our core evidence.
You'd start to be absolutely positive rather than saying this is evidence.
The program's role, it's a management program.
Yeah.
It's an eradication program. We're here to eradicate foxes.
Okay.
We know from the evidence that's collected that there are foxes in the state.
Yes.
We know from that evidence that they're widespread, that the fox activity is from widespread locations across Tasmania. So it's our job to ensure that foxes don't establish, so to run an effective eradication program. If there are people that are trying to divert resources to confuse the issue, that's obviously a concern for us, and we work as hard as we can to try and identify those issues and those people, and to respond appropriately. However, that's not our main role. Our main role is to detect evidence, or to detect areas of fox activity, to respond to those areas, to eradicate foxes.
Sure.
So it's really the whole debate over some of the evidence in the past. Was it hoaxing? Was it not? It's not so relevant to the current program.
Yeah, I understand.
The material we've collected, the material we've collected, we know there are foxes in the state, and it's our job to eradicate them.
I was just talking in terms of public relations, because you're on the front line of that. I just thought it would be something that would be in your interest.
Oh, it's again, there's so much hearsay.
Yeah.
There's so many stories told down at the pub and over back fences, and the media don't necessarily, what's the word? Often a lot of those stories, that hearsay gets reported directly in the media, and people believe what they read in the media. So then it gains momentum. It becomes, you know, people treat it as fact if it's reported in the media. That's not what we deal with. We certainly don't deal with media reports as being fact. We deal with evidence as being fact, and we deal with people in the community that have either seen foxes, seen evidence of their activity, or have found evidence of their activity. We deal with those people with the facts.
Yeah. You touched on people wanting to remain anonymous when they've found it. Why do you think that is?
I think it's fairly clear why people want to remain anonymous, and it's fairly clear why we have the anonymity of the Fox hotline, the sightings hotline, and that's because anyone that pops their head up in the state and says, "I've seen a fox," is ridiculed, which is an incredibly damaging thing for the fox eradication effort, because we need to get as much information as we can. We need that information from the community so we have a better idea of what's happening out there in the landscape. Anytime, and we've seen it recently with a couple of people that have made fox sighting reports, they've then gone out into the media and they've talked about their fox sighting reports. They've then been ridiculed. They've been ridiculed by people, not necessarily from their local communities, but from people, you know, elsewhere in the state, particularly through things like the online blogs and those types of media.
What I find surprising about that, though, is it seems to be unique to fox sightings, because you get anyone that sees a ghost or a UFO or a thylacine, and they love the attention. They'll tell me about?
I mean, I don't really know about those sort of areas.
Well, I know a lot of people that reckon they're seeing it and they'll tell anyone.
We have, I mean, you'll see in the newspapers there are people that have made fox sighting reports and have been in the newspapers to talk about their sighting reports. There are people that are quite happily stand up and say, yeah, I've seen foxes in Tasmania. There are also people that have provided evidence in the past who have wanted to go out and say, look, I'm quite happy to go out there and talk about my experience, to talk about the fact that I saw this animal, or that I had this evidence collected on my property. I've got no problems at all. We will always inform them of the risk that they run in doing that. The fact that, yes, you might get ridiculed in the public if you come forward and you put your name to that report. So we always try to make sure people are aware of what the consequences might be if they do put their name to particular reports, because we're very concerned about getting information. We need that. Yeah, we need that information. We don't want people offside. We want to know that if someone sees something, if someone sees an animal they believe to be a fox, that they are comfortable to report it to the hotline, so that we can then take action to identify whether there is a fox in that location. What we don't want is someone not reporting it because they're worried that they're going to get ridiculed.
But what's striking is that, I mean, the 4 carcasses, the hard evidence, they're all surrounded by, well, not surrounded by, they all involve people wanting to remain anonymous. They've been moved and things like that.
Well, the 2001 Bosworth fox didn't. The person that shot it was the one that found it and then handed it in and reported it.
Yeah.
So, and there were 2 hunters involved in that killing of that animal, and both of them made stat decks, made statements to the wildlife rangers, and they never changed their story. They always had the same story. Other people have then come in and said, oh no, this happened or that happened.
Okay.
But they're not the ones that were involved in that particular event. And the ones that were involved in that particular event made their statements and didn't change them. So you've got other people saying other things, but they weren't necessarily involved in that particular event.
Yep.
And there's no further information that they're bringing forward or further evidence that they're bringing forward to discredit what these people have said. And that's a very good example of where people have come forward, and these gentlemen shot a fox in Tasmania. They've then come forward with that, and as soon as they came forward with that, they were ridiculed from a whole range of different areas.
Sure.
Not necessarily by people that knew anything about that event or that incident. A lot of the information that gets reported is, oh, so-and-so told me, this person told me, that person told me. I mean, as any lawyer will know, that's just hearsay. So we don't deal with that. We deal with the facts and the evidence that we're presented with.
As far as evidence goes, I mean, I've just been making rough notes this when I've been reading the Old Beach fox, the blood that was found. There was only blood found there. I know it was a huge mess of a site and everything.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you expect to find hair as well as blood?
I mean, that was before my time in terms of that investigation. But again, we're dealing with small amounts of data, small amounts of information. The fact that we managed to get blood there is a big thing. We know from the camera monitoring that was done in that area that there were a range of different animals there. Again, I don't really have all the facts for that particular situation, but the fact that we're dealing with small amounts of evidence in general. So for any animal in that landscape, you're only getting small traces of that particular animal. If you go out there looking for devils in the landscape, looking for any animal that's in low numbers, you're only ever finding traces of those animals. When the fox, if it was a native species, would be considered critically endangered in Tasmania. It's in very low numbers. Trying to find an animal like that, trying to find sign of its activity, is incredibly difficult. We know that from all the research that's been done, even on big carnivores, on things like pumas and mountain lions, or puma is a mountain lion, on things like the big cats. They spend thousands and thousands of hours trying to locate an animal that's many times larger than a fox, trying to locate footprints, trying to get hair samples from hair traps, trying to get photos on motion cameras, and they don't get it, because these animals are very good at avoiding detection. You've got to have, again, it's that needle in a haystack. You've got to be in the right place at the right time. And at Old Beach, they just happen to have something in the right place at the right time to get a trace of an animal in that area. But it is, again, you're dealing with very low probabilities of detection. Yeah.
I mean, looking at the map of the evidence where it is, it looks pretty daunting. I mean, it's so widespread. And there's, I know in 2001, when the feds said they weren't going to fund it. I think Robert Hill said, "Oh, it's too late." Do you get a sense that, oh shit, if there is this much evidence and they're covering this much of Tasmania, that eradication is impossible?
Look, we really don't know what the evidence means. We've got so little information that it's hard to draw any conclusions from it, other than we know that there are foxes in the state. Again, we know that there aren't large numbers of them, because if there were large numbers, they'd be much more visible, and their impacts would be much more visible. We don't know, from the analysis of that evidence, we've been able to identify 15 individual animals in Tasmania. We don't know whether those 15 are the ones that are responsible for all the other scats that have been collected, and all the other evidence and all the sightings that we're receiving. So we don't know whether those animals are moving around, are wide-ranging in the landscape, or they're widespread. We really just don't have enough information to make that call. The people, the experts that we rely on to guide the program and to inform the program, tell us that we still have a chance at eradication. While we're not seeing large numbers of foxes, while we're not seeing those large impacts, then the population is still in an establishment phase, and we've still got a chance to eradicate it while it's in that stage. Once we do start seeing large numbers of animals, once they become highly visible, once everyone agrees that they're here and they're saying, what are we going to do about it? It's going to be too late for eradication.
Totally.
So until we hit that point, we still believe we're in a firm position to be able to eradicate foxes. But it's going to be very difficult to know when we've lost the battle.
On that map, you've got possible and excellent sightings. What's the difference?
Basically, for any sighting report that we receive, there's an objective set of criteria that we use to rank the sighting in terms of the information that's provided. So it's things like the distance from the animal that was observed, the lighting conditions, the weather conditions. It's also whether the person that's observed the animal has experience with foxes, has experience with native wildlife. So there's a whole range of criteria that we use. It's pretty much a tick a box, and a certain number of ticks puts it into excellent, and a certain number of ticks puts it into a possible. And there's also another category, unlikely, if it seems like there's not a lot of detail for the report. That's not saying that an unlikely report is more or less likely to be of an actual fox. It's just for our response, because we only have a limited amount of resources, we've got to be able to assess which one do we deal with first. So we try to deal with all sighting reports as best we can, and we have to do that based on the information that we're provided. So if we get a report from someone that knows their wildlife, has experience with foxes, observed the animal for a long period of time at close distance, that would go in as an excellent sighting report. If it's someone that's not familiar with foxes, not familiar with their native wildlife, saw the animal at a large distance, rainy night, then it's probably going to go in as possible. But it's just for prioritising our response. So we try and get out to investigate as many of those sighting reports as we can.
Now I'm just going to go to, what got me interested in this was that Clive Marks article, which I'm sure you've read, and the points that he made in it.
Again, I won't really address
I
points,
understand,
it's not my job and not appropriate to do
general
it.
things, but irrefutable evidence as opposed to belief. I mean, is there irrefutable evidence for foxes as opposed to a belief, which brings in the precautionary principle? Yeah.
The fox eradication program is an evidence-based response. So the program exists because of the evidence of a fox population in Tasmania.
Okay, cool.
I think that's probably the simplest and shortest answer for that one.
Yeah.
We're an evidence-based response. We're a management program to eradicate foxes in the state.
Yeah. Just going back, I know it's before your time, but this all started with that. It didn't all start. I know there was the 1998 fox that jumped off the boat,
Bernie, yep.
But also the story which was used by Llewellyn and a lot of other people to talk about, the story that foxes were reared here and bred. Has that been? I mean, the police report found no evidence. Is that still something that is it on your radar to dismiss or to use as
again, the current program is responding to the evidence that's been collected over the past 10 years that shows us we have foxes in the state. In terms of some of the historical information about possibilities of foxes being bred and released in the state, we know from the historical record that foxes have been brought into the state pretty much since the state's been settled.
That's right.
We also know that there are communities out there which will generally believe and will tell you that yes, foxes were bred within the state and were released. It's recognised in some communities in the Midlands that happened, through the 1930s through to the late 70s, and there's still people that will tell you that foxes were bred and released in the state up until the late 1990s. But in terms of substantiating those allegations, there was never any evidence to substantiate it, and we're dealing with, again, people's opinions, people's beliefs, and hearsay. But you will find there's a lot of people out there that will tell you, yes, foxes were bred in Tasmania, and yes, foxes were released.
Do you know anything about the destroyed cages or whatever they were that Clive Mark saw photos of? He was shown photos of. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't know.
He stated in something completely different, that he saw pictures of these where they'd been reared and they'd all been destroyed, and he was shown pictures, and it wasn't Tasmania.
There's some. I mean, with the whole issue, there's often factual confusion regarding the fox issue. I've seen reference to footage of the 1998 fox that came off the ship at Burnie. There's, to the best of the program's knowledge, there's no footage of a fox coming off a ship in Burnie. So
there wasn't footage. I thought there was video footage of it.
We don't know of any of that. No,
so it's reported everywhere. There's video footage.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, that's the thing. We don't know where some of this comes from because we don't have access to that information, or we don't have access to any footage of a fox coming off a ship in Burnie. So I don't know where that's come from. It's certainly nothing the program's seen, or no one that I know in the program has seen. So this is what we deal with the issue. There's lots of factual inconsistencies, and there's a lot of hearsay that gets reported as fact or as truth.
How cooperative are the people at the docks up there, because that's been identified as a hotspot for how they can get here? Isn't it, after the scandal that it caused, wouldn't it be in people working there, their interests to turn a blind eye or not report it? Have you got a relationship with...
Barrier security and maintaining the biosecurity of Tasmania is an incredibly important thing, obviously. It's one of the main roles of the fox eradication program is to work with organisations like Quarantine Tasmania to ensure that the risk of any foxes getting to the state in the future is minimised. Basically, we're not opening ourselves up to the chance of foxes getting into the state in future. There's been a lot of work done looking at the risk from foxes either accidentally being brought into the state through things like shipping lanes, or deliberately being brought into the state. In terms of deliberately being brought in, that's always going to be a risk. If someone wanted to bring an animal into the state, there's a large coastline out there, there's lots of small ports, there's lots of small airstrips. They could do it. The penalties are severe, and the penalties for the state in terms of our wildlife, our agriculture and economy would be severe as well. So we hope that the Tasmanian community recognises the serious nature of doing any act like that. In terms of accidental introductions, all the work that's been done and all the information from fox experts indicates that the possibility of accidental introductions through going onto a container ship, through getting into a container, is low. And there's been work done looking at port facilities, fencing of port facilities, the monitoring of port facilities to make sure that the risk from fox incursions is reduced. And we work closely with ports in Tasmania as well as Port of Melbourne and loading facilities in Melbourne to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce that risk. So in the past in Melbourne there's been fox control programs that have been run in the Docklands area to make sure that we're reducing fox numbers in those areas. Some of the work we've done recently, people in Melbourne have reported that they've seen a drop in the number of foxes in that area. And that might be because a lot of the wastelands, a lot of the previous habitat that foxes may have been using has been converted to hard standing and storage areas, and also there's been a lot of urban development in the Docklands area. So the habitat suitability has probably been reduced a bit for foxes in those areas. But all the work that's been done, and there was an intensive review of the import risk threats for foxes getting into Tasmania, and that work has all shown that the risk is considered to be fairly low of them accidentally being introduced into the state. But it is always a concern, and it is something we will continue to monitor and to work with Quarantine Tasmania to ensure that we're making sure the risk is kept as low as possible.
I know you've talked about, it's all evidence-based and belief versus that. As far as breeding population, I understand it's your position there is a breeding population.
We've got no evidence of a breeding population, no.
Okay.
So again, we deal with evidence. Until we get that evidence,
Yep.
we're just dealing with the fact that we know there are foxes in Tasmania.
Sure. Yep. That's right. Strike it.
For us, I mean, we deal in fairly simple terms with the issue because we've got access to the hard facts and access to the evidence. We know there are foxes in the state, and we know that we have a strategy and a plan to be able to eradicate those foxes if we get the support we need. And that's the big question, if we get that support from the Tasmanian community. If the Tasmanian community want foxes to be eradicated, they will be eradicated. We have the ability at this point in time to be successful in the eradication effort, but it does require that support. It does require people to take action, to be vigilant, to report fox sightings, and when we're asking for permission to access properties for monitoring fox activity or to undertake fox baiting programs because we've identified that that area either has confirmed fox activity from evidence that's been collected or it has the type of habitat that's highly suitable for foxes, we need that permission to come onto properties to make sure that we're exposing every fox out there in the Tasmanian landscape to lethal control methods, so to lethal baiting programs.
Okay, just about done. Yeah. I think, did I ask before if any scats have been found near the baiting station?
You didn't?
No?
No. There have been scats. Firstly, in terms of scats that are collected, we know that there's probably scats that we've collected in the state that have come from foxes that haven't come back as being fox positive. DNA degrades. We can only analyse the DNA that's there. If there's no DNA and a proportion of our scats come back as no DNA, it's degraded. You can't identify what animal that scat came from. So there have been scats that have been collected from near or in bait stations, excavated bait stations. Again, you've got to be in the right place at the right time, and you've got to have everything in your favour.
Yeah, sure.
To get a fox positive scat result, you've got to have been there fairly soon after the fox has deposited that scat, because DNA only lasts a certain amount of time, and you've then got to get it through for analysis, and everything's got to be in your favour to get that tick.
How distinctive are fox scats? Because I know, that you've got the dogs there to identify them, but just to an expert on shit,
yeah.
How distinctive is it possible just to look at it?
You can't really tell a fox scat from a carnivore scat of similar size. If you've got a carnivore that's the same sort of size, that's eating the same sort of food, so a devil, a quoll, a cat or a dog are all similar sized, or can be similar sized animals to foxes. If they're eating the same sort of food, they've got the same sort of size bumhole, they're producing a scat that looks very similar.
Sure.
So you can't visually, or from the morphology of a scat, say definitively it's fox or it's something else, which is why we have to do the DNA analysis. In the past, we've also used content analysis to identify fox scats, because there's a proportion of fox scats that will have grooming hairs in them from when the animal's been grooming itself, and you can use that to identify whether you've got a fox scat or a cat scat or a dog scat.
The process for analysing the scats, they're sent, I believe, to Perth, is that correct?
Sent to the University of Canberra.
Canberra?
Yep.
Where did I get Perth from?
Once they'd been through the University of Canberra and they'd received a fox positive result, the DNA from those scats was then sent to University of Western Australia, where they undertook the genotyping to identify, or trying to get an individual genetic profile of the animal. So it goes to Canberra to determine whether it's a fox positive scat or not, and once it comes back as fox positive, the DNA was then sent to sent to Western Australia. That's actually changed. The person that did it in WA, it's a fairly specialised, as you might appreciate, fairly specialised field, and you can't just get a fox DNA analysis kit off the shelf and run scats through to analyse them for DNA. You've got to have a lab set up where someone's doing that research, and there happened to be someone in Western Australia doing that research, and we'd send the DNA across to him, or the University of Canberra would. He's now moved somewhere else, so we're actually sending it back to, I think it goes to Canberra now, but I'm not sure. That's why we haven't had any results. It might be we don't get any results, but that's why we haven't announced any recent results regarding genotyping. There's probably about 15 scats, I think, which are scheduled to be tested, but I'm not sure whether they're in the process of being tested or where they're at the moment.
And these labs, they're dealing with scat and DNA analysis coming in from all over the country?
They've got a range of different projects that they're dealing with. We have a relationship with the IACRC, Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre, and they've got facilities dedicated to processing the scats that we send them. So they have a fairly well set up analysis laboratory to analyse the scats that we get, because we send quite a lot of poo to Canberra.
Yeah, that's a lot back. How often is that process reviewed independently? Is there anyone reviewing the way that's done? Has that ever been reviewed?
Basically the people that run those labs, the IACRC is a conglomerate of all people involved in pest animal control and research, and so there's a whole range of people that review those processes.
But they're all inside that organisation?
Well, it's the pest animal control community within Australia are all know each other, all sort of basically associated and related. The IACRC is an umbrella that sits over the top of government, private industry, universities, and helps to provide a means of sharing information and knowledge. So it's really a way of making sure that the things that you're doing are using best practice and are using the best available procedures. In terms of the analysis that's undertaken, there's been a range of people who are experts in that field that have looked at the processes that are being used. Some of those were involved in the Public Accounts Committee inquiry and reviewed the processes that were undertaken to analyse scats, and said that they're the best processes you could be using. Yeah. We're doing things, basically we need every advantage that we can in the fox eradication effort, and all the processes that we use, we basically try to use world's best practice. So we have things reviewed very regularly by both the internal experts, but also getting that external input. And we try to get as much involvement as we can from the scientific community, because we do need every bit of help that we can get to try and give us an edge in eradicating foxes in Tasmania, because it's not an easy task. It's a very challenging program.
What I was getting at, because I mean they deal with the big umbrella organisation, deal with the 1080 baits, they deal with the analysis and everything. Is anyone independently looking at the way that they do that?
Well, they don't. The organisation, the organisation itself isn't like a what's the word? It's not like a I'm trying to think of what the term would be. It's not like a parent body. All it is a way of establishing that communication. So it involves all those different organisations, because they're all involved in pest animal control, and they all have different things to contribute. So it's a way of getting that information flow and information sharing going on. It's also a way.
Is it a private company?
IACRC.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the actual governance and how it's all structured, but it's like the Cooperative Research Centre for Temperate Hardwood Forestry that we have in Tasmania, UTAS, or it used to be Temperate Hardwood Forestry. It's like any cooperative research centre anywhere in the world. They're there to try and get all the people with the expert knowledge to communicate, to pass on that information, and that's the primary role of those organisations, is to get that information sharing going on, so that things are being done best practice, being done in the best way possible. So
one thing that someone put to me the other day, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, that if a fox came from an urban environment in Melbourne and had pretty much almost certainly been living there its whole life, because I mean it wouldn't come in from the bush and be on living in the docks. If it came across in a ship, why would it disappear out of the urban environment? Why would it run off into the bush?
I mean, I couldn't really. It's a completely hypothetical
it would
situation.
Hang around an urban environment, because that's what it was.
I'm not an expert on fox psychology. I don't know what one particular fox is going to do under a particular set of circumstances. It'd be hard to to speculate, and it would just be speculation.
It would be,
if you speak to the experts, they'll probably give you 5 or 6 different answers. And that is the real challenge. We don't know what's going on in Tasmania. We don't know whether foxes are remaining in one area or whether they're dispersing. We don't know whether they're breeding. We don't know whether the evidence that we've collected is from a small number of wide-ranging foxes or it's from a widely dispersed population. We can speculate, but it is just speculation. Until we get further information, we can't make any sort of definite statements or definite claims. What we do know is we've got foxes in the state, and at the moment it appears that we've got the chance to eradicate them. So that's what the Fox Eradication Program is here to do, and to try and work with the community to ensure we get the best chance of being successful in eradicating those foxes.
Just one thing to clarify, the 4 carcasses that have been found, how many have been proven to have actually lived in Tasmania as opposed to come in dead?
Well, all the 4 carcasses that are on the recent evidence record, of course we've had carcasses in the state for over the past 150 years. The 4 carcasses that are on our evidence record are carcasses that have been collected in Tasmania, and there is no evidence to say that they're not from anywhere but Tasmania. So we do things like there's been gut content analysis, there's been fur analysis looking at the pollens and the dust. We deal with the evidence as it's presented, and the evidence that's presented is of a fox carcass that has been picked up in Tasmania.
Then the evidence is that you've got a dead fox, it's not that it's been alive. Do you know what I'm getting at? It's just a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but again, it'd be if you put the shoe on the other foot, you'd be negligent in your responsibility to the environment, to looking after the state, if you were ignoring all this evidence. If we had those 4 carcasses that have been picked up, and 56 scats and footprints and all these fox sighting reports, and we're doing nothing, it'd be incredibly negligent, and it'd be an incredible risk to the state. If you were doing nothing about this, you'd have to be asking, why on earth are you ignoring all that information? Why are you taking that risk that it's going to result in incredibly devastating consequences for the environment, for our wildlife, for the economy, for agriculture, for tourism, for the whole state? We'd just end up being another mini mainland. We'd have no wildlife. We'd have impacts on the agriculture. Our clean green image, that'd be out the window if we had foxes established in the state. Nature-based tourism, that would all be changed. And just looking at the work they're doing at the moment, trying to conserve and protect the Tasmanian devils, all the millions of dollars that are being funneled into that one species. If you had foxes here, you'd be funneling that money into any number of species, trying to conserve and protect all those. So if we were ignoring all that evidence, I'm sure there'd be a lot of people out there that are saying, why, when you've got this hard evidence, okay, you've got a fox carcass that's been picked up side of the road in Tasmania, why would you ignore that? Why would you say, maybe it was from elsewhere? You're dealing with the evidence that's been presented. It's there, it's in Tasmania. Unless there's other evidence that says that it's not, unless you do a gut content analysis and you find a numbat in there or a lead-beater's possum, you've got no reason not to believe that that's an animal that's been in Tasmania, living in Tasmania. And things like the endemic species that was found in the Bosworth fox in 2001 is evidence of an animal that's been living in the state.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And same for the Scat analysis that's undertaken. People sometimes say, well, you don't have any endemic species in there. We don't have an endemic species. We've got things like eastern barred bandicoot and quoll species, which are found in very small ranges on the mainland. So the likelihood is, yes, if you've got evidence of those animals in a scat, it's come from Tasmania. But the big thing is, we're not finding evidence of anything you wouldn't find in Tasmania. There's a whole range of animals on the mainland that we don't have here in Tasmania. We've never found anything in any of those scats that is not from Tasmania. So when people are saying, oh, you're not finding, paddy melon, or you're not finding this, or you're not finding that, we're not. But we're not finding numbat, we're not finding lead-beater's possum, we're not finding anything from the mainland. So again, the evidence that we have is pointing to that we've got a serious problem here. That we've got either a widespread or wide-ranging fox population. If you want to ignore it, you're doing it at your peril, but future generations might pay for it. So we can't afford not to take action, not to do something now. So that's what the program is here to do. Yeah.
That's a very good way to end it, I think. Yeah.
It's a crazy situation.
Yeah.
Because it is such a significant risk to the state. It is such a huge threat, and there's there's a huge weight of evidence that's accumulated over the past 10 years. We've got ongoing sighting reports, and we've got some very credible people. We've got hunters, we've got shooters, we've got people from the mainland that know foxes that are reporting seeing animals in the state. And they just shake their heads. They don't know why the Tasmanian community, given all the evidence and given the fact that people are seeing foxes in the state, they don't know why the Tasmanian community is not all behind the fox eradication effort. They don't understand it. They know what the impacts are. They live on the mainland. They've seen the impacts. Same for people overseas. They get down here and they shake their heads. They don't understand why there's such a question over it, why there's so many sceptics out there. The good thing is the communities we've worked in, and most of the work we do in Tasmania shows us a lot of support and a lot of understanding for the issue. It's a very complex issue. It's a very difficult challenge that we have, but most people, firstly, don't want foxes in the state. That's pretty much a given. There's I think probably not many people in the state that would want to see foxes established. Most people are aware of what the impacts would be. So they want action to be taken, and they want to make sure that that the state is protected from what is a very serious and devastating threat. So we find that there is a lot of support out there in the community. There's a bit of scepticism, there's a bit of criticism that we get, which is fair enough. All government organisations, government departments should be reviewed, should be checked. There should be people keeping an eye on them. That's all part of the democratic process, and that's good governance. That everything that we do is looked into. And the people that are often the biggest critics are sometimes the most vocal people. So they tend to get reported in the media because the media like to put issues out there and sell papers and stir up things sometimes just to see what shakes out. But the good thing is most of the people on the ground, the people we work with, they understand the issue, they understand the threat, and they understand that we need to take action, and they support what's being done. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's the sense I got at the Margate meeting. Was really supportive. Yeah.
No, most of the public information sessions, you might find one or two people that are either sceptics or critics. They're often very vocal in those meetings, but the 25, 30 other people that are sitting there, some of them don't really know much about the issue, don't really know much about the evidence as well. But are all very supportive of action, the need for action to be taken, and doing what they can to help, to do their bit to.
Do you think there's anything you could have done better or could do better that could really?
Oh, hindsight's a wonderful thing. You can always look back and say, there's lots of things we could have done better.
Early on, when the funding was short, it seemed that there was just everything happened a bit too late. You'd find some evidence, and it would take a while for
we've been really lucky in the government recognised very early on the serious risk and the threat, and the government took action. But it's always been an evolution, an evolving process. It's getting the most information we could at the time, making the best decision about how to respond to that evidence, undertaking some sort of response, and then looking at the result, and then looking at the information, looking at the evidence that we've got going forward. So it's been to get to where we are now. There's been changes, and we've done things which may not have been the best way to do things or the most effective way, but we've been constantly reviewing it and constantly looking back and working out how we can improve our chances of achieving eradication success. So I think, there's been mistakes that have been made in the past, but that's part of any program, any process. But those mistakes have been learnt from, and that's the important thing. We've constantly been reviewing what we're doing and getting that input so that we're doing things in the most effective way that we can. Because we can't afford not to. It's too great a risk. If we aren't successful in eradicating foxes, then the state's going to be paying for that for forever and a day.
Indeed. Yes. Oh, very good. Well, thanks very much for your time.
No worries. No worries. Happy to talk about the issue.
Yeah.